Hello and welcome back to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judyth Sassoon. Welcome to episode 5, Pliosaur Evolution and Extinction. Today we'll be exploring the evolution and extinction of these magnificent animals and a few things around that sort of subject. This series is sponsored by the Ruskin Mill Trust, who is an educational charity that operates in England, Scotland and Wales. They offer exciting outdoor learning environments and utilise practical land and craft activities to support the development of work and life skills in young people with autism and other learning difficulties. I will be your host, Ash Hall. For this series, I am joined by Dr. Judyth Sassoon, paleobiologist and pliosaur expert from Bristol University.
Hello, hi Ash.
Today, Judith, I'm going to be firing two main talking points at you, and they're big ones. How or why did pliosaurs evolve, and how or why did they go extinct? And the next episode will focus on all of the steps in between. So can you tell me, Judith, how did pliosaurs evolve?
So that is a big question. Yes, that's quite right. I think maybe the first thing to clarify, if we're going to talk about pliosaurs in this way, is to remind everyone of something that I think we said in the first episode, that the word pliosaur can have, let's say, two meanings, effectively two meanings, a broad meaning and a narrow meaning. So the broad meaning is when you apply the word to any animal within the plesiosauria that had a large skull and a shorter neck, the plesiosaurs being the ones with the long necks and the small heads. And that would include a number of groups that are unrelated, because this large-headed, short-necked body plan evolved within the plesiosauria a number of times. The more narrow view of pliosaurs, more narrow definition of what pliosaurs are animals within what we call the pliosauridae, which would effectively include two large genera, meaning Pliosaurus and the Brachiocanine group, and a number of other animals which in fact don't have large heads and short necks. So I think we're going to sort of focus more on the Pliosauridae when you're asking about pliosaur evolution, but I may on occasion talk about the other groups as well, just to give a bigger picture. So where should we start? I think the best place to start is to say that all the pliosauromorphs, all the animals with the large heads and the short necks, evolved within the group, the Plesiosauria, as I've already said. And the Plesiosauria evolved, well, diversified, shall we say. They evolved quite far back within the Triassic, late Triassic, and diversified in the early Jurassic. And their evolution, and within that, the evolution of the pliosaurs, you might say, are in some sense driven by a number of extinction events. So what seems to have happened at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary is that there was a very significant extinction event called the TJ extinction. And this seems to have been driven by volcanic activity within the Atlantic. And with that, with the volcanic activity, you of course got climate changes and changes within the oceans, which on the one side eliminated species, and some species that were eliminated would include, for example, the very large ichthyosaurs, and also eliminated a number of groups from the group, the Sauropterygia, in which the plesiosaurs are nested, which plesiosaurs belong to. So placodonts and nothosaurs, they became extinct at the boundary. However, plesiosaurs, or small plesiosaurs, survived that event and went off into the Jurassic, and the extinction of species opened up niches into which plesiosaurs diversified. So that is the beginning of the story, you might say, of pliosaurs. And early on, in the early Jurassic, we had groups such as Romaleosaurids, which have a larger head and a slightly shorter neck than the plesiosaurs. But they are a separate group from the pliosaurs proper, as it were. And other small plesiosaur-like creatures, such as species like Thalassiodracon, were around, and they have small heads and longer necks, and they are the basal groups of what later became the pliosaurs that interest us, I think, the ones that evolved into the large pliosaur groups. So within the Jurassic, we have, as it were, sort of a period of experimentation. Following the mass extinction event, the climates then settled down. They became quite warm, and there was the possibility of very complex food chains emerging, and high rates of photosynthesis in the oceans, and that would encourage growth of phytoplankton and encourage the growth of food for various animal groups. Niches, as I said, were opened up through the extinction of previous groups, and these plesiosaurians evolved, and among them evolved the pliosaur group, the pliosaurs that we're talking about. So the early pliosaurs, we're talking here about the Middle Jurassic, they were quite small compared to what they became later. There were, for example, animals such as Pelaneustes, Cymolestes. These were called the Oxford clay pliosaurs, and they had skulls maybe about a metre, slightly over a metre long, and maybe in themselves they could grow to 5-6 metres in length. And these are considered small pliosaurs. And they had various predatory adaptations with quite sharp teeth, larger skulls, shorter necks, as we said before. And then later, from within these Oxford clay, the Middle Jurassic pliosaurs, we come to the Late Jurassic, the Upper Jurassic, where pliosaurs evolved larger body plans, became larger in size. And they continued to get larger in size right across the boundary from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. And then within the Cretaceous, the body size seemed to diminish. But I think we're going to talk about the extinction of pliosaur a little bit later. What I wanted to sort of give as a picture was the importance of an extinction event at the very beginning of the diversification, which enabled pliosaur evolution, and also perhaps now to mention that at the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, there seemed to also have been another event which led to faunal change and which eliminated some of the large pliosaur groups and also allowed another of the large pliosaur groups to continue. So the Pliosaurus group perhaps seemed to have been affected more by that, and the brachiocanine pliosaurs, within which we have Kronosaurus, continued off into the Cretaceous.
It's a lot to digest, isn't it?
It is, yes. I'm sorry that was such a long answer.
It's understandable. As you mentioned, we'll look at the kind of extinction a bit later, but from an evolution point of view, you've mentioned various niches and there being more food available, which makes sense. Yeah. Obviously, those large Triassic ichthyosaurs have died out. They presumably would have been the top of the food chain. So that's gone. And then you've got rebirth of an ecosystem. So you're going to have all this new fauna appearing, etc., etc. So we know they got larger. That Middle Jurassic, you start to see like Lorrainosaurus and then Cymolestes and the Oxford clay and things like that. And they were getting bigger. But why did they get so big? And that must be a really difficult question to answer. But like, if you look at the largest marine reptiles ever, which were the mosasaurs, 18 meters long, some of those, even then, I won't say largest because you had the ichthyosaurs, but the large mosasaurs, which were about 18 meters long, they had skulls about 1.3 meters.
Yes.
So that's big, but these are humongous. 25% of the body plan is a skull in this case. So is there any reason they got such large skulls?
I think I need to say a couple of things here. So one of the things is you're comparing pliosaurs to mosasaurs, and you're saying, okay, the mosasaurs got quite big, but their skulls were smaller. It's to do with how the body plan can allow for certain changes. So if there's the proportions of the skull in a mosasaur for the animal to work biochemically, perhaps could not get bigger without the rest of the animal getting bigger. So I don't think one can really compare those two. Yes, you're quite right. The ichthyosaurs, actually, the early ichthyosaurs, the shastosaurids, were actually bigger than the pliosaurs that we know about, although mysteriously there are some vertebrae from Abingdon, for example, in Britain, where we have the suggestion that pliosaurs can be a lot bigger than the ones we imagine at the moment. So I think the maximum size for our pliosaurs right now, we estimate at about 13 meters, but the Abingdon vertebrae, which are a lot bigger. We don't have a skull for such a creature, but it could have been a lot bigger than maybe 15, 16 meters possibly. But even that isn't quite as big as the shastosaurs, which grew to 20 meters. So why did they grow so big? I think with evolution, one should understand that things change, that things are in a continuous a continuous system of change, a continuous process of change, and that natural selection happens. So there's no kind of drive towards a bigger size, but a bigger size seems to offer certain opportunities, and within the proportions that the pliosaurs had, maintaining those proportions biochemically effectively, allowed for large sizes to occur and be effective. So, for example, I mean, the large skulls that you're talking about, in themselves, just talking about the bone itself, in themselves, a large skull won't initiate a heavy bite force, but might allow for the accommodation of larger prey. However, in combination with muscle mass, in combination also with bone density, several factors all evolving together can lead to a very, very hard bite force. So it's possible that this large skull evolved with other features to allow for macro predation. And I think that we can see also correlations with the size of the skull, at least in the genus Pliosaurus. The size of the skull, the shape of the teeth, which were clearly sharp and macro-predaceous. The trihedral teeth would be particularly good for ripping into flesh. And also the shape of the symphysis, which got shorter gradually over time. So in the more piscivorous pliosaurs and the smaller ones, some of them would have had quite a long symphysis, a long, I'm just going to show you on the diagram, on the model, a long lower jaw connected up in the symphysis, whereas as they grew larger, that symphysis, that join actually grew shorter. And this, it seems, at least from biomechanical measurements in crocodiles, as an analogy, seems to help the skull resist forces during heavy biting. So there's a number of things working together. So it's not just the size of the skull on its own that matters, but the skull in combination with other features, which enables a macro-predatory existence for these creatures. And that was effective for a while. But one of the things is that when you're an apex predator, so that's a creature that has reached the highest trophic level in a food chain or food web, and which in itself does not have natural predators. Now, we sometimes call these animals top predators. And I find that a little bit misleading because it sort of suggests that they are the best. But being an apex predator, or being a top predator, has huge disadvantages as well. So yes, they can get large prey, they can perhaps seem to be quite ferocious, which for us immediately indicates an advantage. However, they have huge disadvantages. So these apex predators they have a function within a whole ecosystem. Their function is to, in a sense, keep the levels of some of the middle predators or middle trophic levels, the animals in the middle trophic levels, to a certain level, so that the ecosystem works. At the same time, these large predators, these apex predators, have often got slow reproductive rates, and they are very restricted in the diet that they can consume. So any environmental changes, any changes in the ecosystem, tend to affect them more than they do other creatures. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the top predators, why the apex predators are more affected by extinction events than some of the sort of the mesopredators, you might say, or the mesotrophic levels, middle trophic levels in the food chain.
Very briefly, I'm going to go back to this notion of the large skull, because you've mentioned it makes sense when you're filling that niche. It evolves itself through, well, the process of natural selection, effectively. Is it not unusual in itself, though, when you look at the proportions, to have an animal that's 25% head? That's quite a long way to go, isn't it? Like, if you look at how much you've gone from a plesiosaur with a head that is like less than 10% of the length of its body, all the way up to a quarter of the body length. That's a huge
Perhaps one should consider not just the head as a separate thing, but the head and neck as a unit together. And then you can sort of see that if you consider small heads and large necks together, proportionally, you might get the same sort of proportion within the pliosaurs and the plesiosaurs. I think it's actually probably a mistake, even though we have to do this anatomically, to consider parts without really considering the rest and what they do. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. You touched upon then how large, top of the food chain predators, apex predators, essentially become vulnerable through their success. They get to a point where they cannot go any further. They have to remain within the status quo, and then changes to that status quo put them in a place where they aren't adaptable enough to survive certain environments or certain drastic changes. So what happened to the pliosaurs?
Yes, so actually that trophic level probably had quite a lot to do with their extinction. Perhaps just going back to what I said before, so the largest of the pliosaur group, the Pliosaurus, which was the apex predator at the end of the Jurassic, let's say. There was also the brachiocanine pliosaur group, which was a separate group, and that diversified following, or that grew to a larger size, following the boundary, the event from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. And what seemed to have happened then is that there was a kind of faunal turnover. Some sort of climatic change took place, which led to Pliosaurus declining and the brachiocanine pliosaurs diversifying and growing larger. And the largest pliosaurs actually were in the mid-Cretaceous, in the Cretaceous. Now, what seemed to have happened is that towards the late Cretaceous, in the early part of the late Cretaceous, there was an extinction event between the so-called Cenomanian and Turonian stages. There seemed to have been volcanic activity going on there, which led to an anoxic event in the oceans. And that seems to have pretty much, at least the fossil records suggest that event may have eliminated the large pliosaurs altogether. The smaller pliosaur-like creatures, which are not part of the unrelated pliosaurs, as it were, some of them, they would include the polycotylid pliosaurs. They were very, very small compared to what we're talking about, the large brachiocanines. They were living in North America, and they succeeded in crossing that event. They survived it into the Turonian. But the large pliosaur fossils seem to suggest died out. And so that would suggest that they were much more sensitive, to this, whereas the plesiosaurian pliosaurids, they survived. So that eliminated a substantial group of the pliosaurs that we're talking about. Plesiosaurs as a group actually survived right up until the end of the Cretaceous and were probably eliminated by the bolide impact, by the asteroid impact that occurred then, that also finished off the dinosaur, the non-avian dinosaurs, shall I say. So it was extinction events. It was instability in the environment that seems to have taken out the pliosaurs.
That change in environment was about, if I remember rightly, about the 90 million year mark.
Yes.
That was presumably the same thing that affected the ichthyosaurs, which is not what we're here to talk about. But
yes,
we saw the evolution of mosasaurs coming through earlier than that. So did that make these pliosaurs potentially more vulnerable when that event happened?
I actually think that the mosasaurs diversified more following that event. So the large pliosaurs were no longer a thing, and the larger mosasaurs could therefore sort of like step into their into their niche. And I think that event, the Cenomanian Turonian anoxia, on one side eliminated pliosaurs, one apex predator, and promoted the possibilities for a second one to arise, meaning the mosasaurs. Yes.
The same as the Triassic, Jurassic, with the ichthyosaurs being replaced by plesiosaurs.
Yeah, so
later.
that's right. So again, we see the dynamics that the extinction events offer. You know, in one side, sort of closing down one line, but at the same time opening out the possibilities for a second or a third line coming through, and entering a niche and developing itself in a particular way to feed in that niche and to survive in that niche.
Wonderful. Well, that solves all the issues when people ask me how did they die out. Extinction events.
Yes.
Extinction events. That's it. That's the end of it. Just extinction events. It kills everything. No. So very briefly, you touched upon several different lineages of pliosaurs, and you mentioned the polycotyllids, and the brachiocanines and Pliosaurus genus and such. But we will explore that next time.
Yeah, the relations between them are complex, and I think they deserve a full episode for themselves.
That's the plan. It's a bit messy, so we'll go into proper length on that next time. So, in terms of what we call effectively true pliosaurs, the Pliosaurus and the brachiocanines, they go extinct around 90 million years ago, and it's fairly clear-cut why.
Probably, yes. I mean, the fossil records suggest that they didn't survive, but hey, you know, sometimes people find fossils very unusually, and a whole theory is changed because evidence arises. Yeah.
Well, in that case, I have a little bit of a fun speculative question for you, I suppose. Hopefully a fun thought experiment. If you could pick a pliosaur out of time, place it in our current oceans, how do you think it would fare?
Right, so how shall I approach this one? So as a sort of a fun thought experiment in a simplistic way, I probably wouldn't give it very much thought. But actually, if you sort of consider what that actually means, and make a proper thought of experiment out of it, it can... I think I would predict that the pliosaur would not survive at all very long. And the reason I might say that is because if you, as you're saying, basically you're time machining a pliosaur out of the ancient oceans and bunging it into the present. You're not going to be just transferring a pliosaur. One of the things is that animals are not just a sort of like a mechanism. Most animals are ecosystems. are in fact microbiomes. They don't just exist by themselves, they exist in symbiosis with bacteria, with certain fungi, with all sorts of microorganisms, protozoa, and these form a kind of like an ecosystem which is in balance and harmony and generally works very well. So if some of that microfauna is imbalanced, an animal sometimes gets ill because everything is in sync in general, and then it comes out of sync, and that actually leads to an animal getting sick. And if the microfauna in somebody's stomach become affected, the person gets a stomach ache, it gets a stomach infection sometimes. Because this microbiome, these microorganisms that live on animals are also protective. And so what I'm saying is that if you were to transfer a pliosaur from the ancient oceans into the modern times, I think the first thing that would happen is those bacteria would be affected, and that would affect the health of the animal. So irrespective of conditions, even if conditions were fairly, which they wouldn't be, but if they were for some reason similar to the original conditions of the animal, I don't think that organism as an ecosystem would actually be able to maintain itself in a modern ecosystem, because I believe the two things over millions of years to have changed rather radically. That's my theory, at least. It can never really be proven, but anyway, there we are. That's what I think.
I hope it can never be proven. It sounds like a terrifying prospect.
Yeah.
Last thing we want is people grabbing animals from prehistory and checking them about the planet.
I mean, it's a different question, to bring back an extinct animal, because then what you have to consider is that this microflora rather, develops from the moment that an animal starts to sort of feed for itself. So that's a different question, bringing back the mammoth or something like that. I won't say anything more about that, but it is a different question from the question you've just asked.
Looking at our modern environment then, and knowing that you couldn't pluck one from time, dump it in the ocean, and it would be okay. What do you reckon there are the chances are that something may re-evolve in time?
Oh, right. So here we're talking about convergence. So we don't have the lineage, sort of the immediate lineage that the plesiosaurians, we don't have that anymore.
No.
However, as we know, when animals with certain body plans go extinct and niches open out, other animals from different lineages can sometimes converge upon the shapes of the animals that have been extinct. So what we'd be looking for is a four-finned creature with a neck and a head proportion similar to a pliosaur. So we have a number of animals today that converge partially on what we call pliosaurs. They probably function differently biomechanically. But we'd be thinking, I don't suppose that something like that could really evolve out of the mammals. I don't think so. Although maybe, possibly. But it would have to be something like that. The only groups that could really evolve, it would have to be a vertebrate. It would have to evolve out of groups that we have already with us. So that really leaves two options of reptiles and the mammals. And we don't have that many reptiles. And it's possible that a lizard of some sort could, could develop fins and start flapping them around in the same way that a plesiosaur or pliosaur would.
Well, that's how it started for them.
Yeah.
But that'd be a long process.
But it was just a different kind. So I'm only rambling because I'm thrown into confusion here and I don't really know the answer at all. I can speculate only in as much as convergences happen. So anatomically, I don't think there's any reason why not. But it would not be exactly the same, I don't think, yeah. And it would more likely, if it was something similar, it would have to really come out of the reptiles rather than the mammals.
Yeah, well, that touches back on what we discussed previously with the issues with mammals is they're fairly restricted within their body plan and the way the skeletal structure adapts.
Yeah, they move differently. Their limbs are positioned differently than the reptiles, and perhaps it's the position of the limbs that enabled these sort of flapping motions to occur in plesiosaurs and pliosaurs. On the other hand, we have seals that can flap their arms like wings, and turtles, of course, are reptiles, but they, in fact, only flap their forelimbs. So I really don't know, actually.
Well, this is the whole thing. It's all speculative because the planet will change in whatever way it changes, and that's beyond our lifetime. And what will happen one way or the other. But it'll be interesting. It would be interesting to know if it would, wouldn't it? Because Convergence, well, it was successful, very successful. So I suppose it could happen again.
Yeah, and what sorts of novelties we can will emerge in, let's say, 2 million years' time, I have, well, it'd be interesting to see, yes, absolutely.
Well, I think that pretty much covers how they evolved, how they went extinct, and some of the more silly thoughts that I've thrown at you today.
That's silly, very interesting, actually. Yeah.
But yes, so to recap then, evolution driven by extinction events. Extinction driven by extinction events. Effectively, they were subject of the environmental changes, and that's how both what led to their evolution and what led to their extinction. I think that leaves us in a good place to move on to exploring those lineages further next time.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll do. We'll explore just how complicated and messy they really are.
Thank you. That's going to be interesting, I'm sure.
I'm sure it will. You've been listening to Understanding Pliosaurs with Dr. Judith Sassoon. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.